America's trade deficit is widening again. That may sound like a deja vu, but this time it's happening for a reason no one really expected. The very tariffs designed to fix it. This isn't just about campaign slogans or cheap shots at globalization. This is about how tariffs meant to shrink the USA's trade deficit have done actually the opposite, and why that may not exactly be reversible. There will be a few economics concepts along the way, but I'll explain them all super simply. We'll look at what a trade deficit actually is, why tariffs backfire, and why the US might be stuck with this imbalance by design, not by mistake. Before we get into it, as always, here's a question for you. Which country currently runs the largest trade surplus with the US in 2025? Is it Canada, the Netherlands, Denmark, someone else? Pause if you want to guess, comment it down below, I'll reveal the answer at the end. But I admit, I didn't actually know this one, and I definitely learned in making this video. Let's start by clearing the economic fog. Many of us know what trade is, what a tariff is, but I think it's valuable to go over what these things really mean in context from an economics perspective. A trade deficit happens when a country imports more than it exports. In the US, this has been the norm for decades, since the 1970s, in fact. It's not just something the US stumbled into. They made deliberate choices to go into this direction. Why? Because the US is not a manufacturing-first economy anymore. It's a services superpower, a capital magnet, and a consumption engine. Americans buy more stuff than they sell, not just because they want to, but because they can. The paradox is that the trade deficit grows when Americans feel good. When they have jobs, credit, and confidence, they buy, and much of what they buy is made somewhere else. So when politicians talk about fixing the deficit, what they're really talking about is changing consumer behavior, or global finance, or the fundamental role of the dollar. These are not exactly small tweaks. And yet the deficit gets framed like a scoreboard. Imports bad, exports good. Trade deficit, well, we must be losing. But trade is not a game. It's a web of decisions made by millions of people buying phones, cars, fruits, sneakers. The scoreboard metaphor misleads us into thinking that there is a clear villain, when in reality there isn't one. Just economics measuring what it measures. So, enter tariffs. In theory, they're simple. If foreign goods are too cheap, tax them. Make them more expensive. That should make local goods more attractive, right? That's the idea, and that's why in early 2024, the US raised tariffs on over $300 billion worth of imported goods. Steel, cars, dairy, electronics. If it came from abroad, it got hit. And as I'm sure you've all noticed, it seems like the US administration rolls out a fresh batch of tariff changes almost every week, so that's just the world we're living in right now. But global trade isn't a one-way street. When you impose tariffs, other countries respond in a variety of ways. Canada, for instance, was slapped with a 35% tariff. Within weeks, it cut its own imports from the US in retaliation. And these weren't just symbolic gestures, they were real significant changes. Major retailers in Ontario dropped American suppliers almost overnight. Supermarkets that used to be stocked with Wisconsin cheese switched to Quebec cheddar and local alternatives. But this was only the beginning. Faced with unpredictability from its southern neighbor, Canada accelerated its efforts to diversify trade. Ottawa ramped up negotiations with the European Union, signed new agreements, and strengthened ties with the Nordic countries like Denmark, Sweden, and Norway. The aim is to build a trade network less vulnerable to US tariffs and political shocks. For a full deep dive into how Canada is repositioning its entire trade policy, moving beyond the old North American playbook, check out the video that I'm linking here. Then Europe joined in, not with retaliatory tariffs, but with grassroots consumer activism. In Germany, France, and the Netherlands, American brands suddenly faced sharp sales drops, not because of price, but because of politics and shifting public sentiment. Tesla sales, for example, cratered almost overnight, and we'll come back to that later. I've got a couple of other videos that dig even deeper into Canada's growing relationships with the EU and the Nordics. Definitely check them out if you want to understand just how fast the global trade landscape is actually shifting. This spell is what economists call a trade war. It's not about weapons, it's about taxes essentially, and the casualties are usually industries, consumers, us, not armies. By the summer of 2025, the actual data came in and it wasn't subtle. The US exports had declined. Since January 2025, Canada's overall export to the US across all sectors have dropped by approximately 26%, with certain months like April alone seeing more than a 15% decline. Canadian retailers began sourcing produce from Mexico and Europe, citing both price and political stability. Then there's a Tesla European sales, down nearly 28% year on year, mostly due to backlash over tariffs and the broader buy local sentiment sweeping the EU. Tourism, often overlooked in these discussions, was hit even harder. Fewer European and Asian travelers actually visited the US, partly in protest, partly in response to visa frictions and economic tensions. Hotels, airlines, restaurants, they all took the hit. The losses are estimated at over 12 billion. This isn't abstract. These are jobs, paychecks, and livelihoods on the line. Families whose rent or mortgage depend on steady orders coming in from across the border. Small towns built around a single export-dependent farm or factory can feel the shockwaves almost overnight when trade slows down like this. Truck drivers, warehouse workers, dockhands, and local business owners all are affected by decisions made in the distant capital. So when we talk about trade balances, we're not just talking about numbers on a spreadsheet or lines on a graph. We're talking about the actual flow of economic life. Food on the table, pay in the bank, and entire communities that depend on the invisible but powerful links of cross-border commerce. If you want to support this kind of analysis, there's a Ko-fi link below. Every contribution helps. Here's the part that no one wants to say out loud, that this might not actually be reversible. In economics, there is something called trade flow stickiness. Once a buyer, whether it's a supermarket, an automaker, or a logistics company, switches to a new supplier, they tend to stick with them. Even if the old supplier drops prices or tariffs disappear, people don't always necessarily switch back. That's because trade isn't just about cost. It's about trust. Can you rely on this partner to deliver, rain or shine? It's about branding. Sometimes customers start to identify with a new product or even a different national label. It's about logistics too. If your supply chain runs smoother with these new partners, it's hard to justify switching back. And of course, it's about politics. Companies want to avoid future disruptions, so they're less likely to depend on countries seen as a little unpredictable. Look at Tesla's fall in Europe. It isn't just about stickier price, it's about identity. When a German driver switches from a Tesla to a BMW i4 or a Hyundai Ioniq, it's not just a new car, it becomes their car, tied to their country or their values. They rarely actually go back. The same thing happens with food. If Canadian distributors get comfortable sourcing avocados from Mexico or cheese from the Netherlands, the whole process, ordering, shipping, paperwork, becomes second nature. And US suppliers, they're now just another option, not the default anymore. Economists call this a structural decline. It means the change is becoming baked into the system. It's not just a dip that you recover from when a policy changes, it's a long-term shift. So tariffs didn't just make American products more expensive for a while. In many cases, they made them less appealing or even less trusted. And in the process, they handed competitors an opening that might never actually close. If you're enjoying this video so far, I'd love it if you subscribe. The House of L is a community of thoughtful, curious people, and you're very welcome here. Let's bring this whole thing back to that scoreboard idea that everyone loves to use. When the trade deficit goes up, you'll see politicians on TV scrambling, making speeches, waving charts around. To a lot of people, it looks like America is losing some kind of economic game, like something must be broken or out of control, even though that might not actually be true. So what do leaders do? They jump into action, they raise tariffs, they launch Buy American campaigns, and frame it all as some kind of patriotic comeback. It sounds bold, like we're taking back control, right? But the paradox that almost never gets talked about is when you slap tariffs on imports hoping to shrink the trade deficit, you often end up making it even bigger. And that's because Americans still want foreign goods. Maybe it's electronics, clothes, cars, whatever. Even if the price goes up because of tariffs, a lot of people will just grit their teeth and pay more. So imports don't actually fall that much. In economics, this is called inelastic demand. And when prices rise, people still buy, maybe because there aren't great alternatives, or the product is essential. That's why imports don't drop as much as politicians hope for when tariffs go up. Meanwhile, American exports, the stuff sold to other countries, tend to take a real hit. Not because the product suddenly got worse, but because other countries hit back. They slapped their own tariffs on American goods or simply decided to buy elsewhere. Sometimes it's about saving face. Other times it's just easier or safer to go with a different supplier. The end result is that the trade deficit, the so-called scoreboard number, actually gets worse and not better. Tariffs can create this illusion that something big is being done, that American jobs are being defended, but underneath all that, there are huge forces at work. Currency exchange rates, the way global money moves around, complex supply chains, and just basic consumer preferences. These things are way bigger than any single policy or political campaign. They don't bend just because somebody passes a new law. These are what economists call structural forces. Things like exchange rates, global capital flows, and how supply chains get locked in over years. No quick fix or a single tariff can bend these forces overnight. So the story isn't as simple as it sounds in those press conferences. The reality is far more messier, global, and it's driven by a lot more than what's actually happening in Washington. Which brings us to the big question. Should the US even try to fix the trade deficit? It's worth stopping for a second to talk about the US dollar, because when people say that it's the global reserve currency, that's not just financial mumbo jumbo. It actually shapes how the whole world does business. What it means is that when governments or big companies anywhere want a safe place to park their money or need to pay for things like oil, airplanes, or international loans, they almost always use US dollars, even if the deal doesn't directly involve the United States. Central banks keep huge stashes of dollars because it's seen as the safest, most reliable currency out there. That's what gives the dollar its gravitational pull. All this global demand pushes up the value of the dollar, which makes it cheaper for Americans to buy imported goods, but also means that American-made products cost more for other countries, making exports fundamentally harder to sell. This is the price of being the world's financial hub. In exchange, the US enjoys a unique set of privileges, nearly unlimited access to cheap capital, the ability to borrow easily, fund major innovation and infrastructure, and run both government and trade deficits without sparking a crisis. But of course, there is a flip side. Because the world is set up to favor the US dollar, Americans will almost always end up buying more than they sell. It's not necessarily a sign of decline. It's just the cost of being the world's default economy. Economists actually have a name for this, the Triffin dilemma. It's the paradox where for the US dollar to serve as the world's go-to currency, America almost always has to run a trade deficit. The rest of the world wants dollars, so the US sends dollars out by buying more than it sells. It's a built-in feature of the global system. It's not actually a bug. That's the real question for policymakers and for voters. Is this a weakness to fix, or simply the inevitable trade-off for having the dollar at the center of everything? All right, let's circle back to that quiz question from earlier. Which country runs the largest trade surplus with the US? It's actually the Netherlands. In 2025, the US exports far more to the Netherlands than it imports, creating a massive surplus, over 55 billion last year alone. This is partly because the Netherlands is a major logistics and distribution hub for Europe. A lot of goods that enter Dutch ports, especially in Rotterdam, are then shipped out across the rest of the European continent. So while it looks like the US is selling a ton to the Netherlands, much of it is actually destined for other European countries. It's a good reminder that when it comes to trade, the numbers can tell a very different story than the actual headlines. But even that points back to the bigger issue. The trade deficit isn't a battle to be won, it's a mirror. It reflects how Americans live, what they buy, what they prioritize, where their industries are strongest, and where they've let go of manufacturing as a national project. Tariffs are an attempt to bend that mirror, to make it reflect something else, but in doing so, they often distort the image, and unfortunately, it looks like they might just break the glass entirely. If you want to see how other countries wrestled with this and how Canada's tariff boomeranged right back at the USA, this video is next, Canada's trade revolution and how tariffs actually backfired on the US. The US trade deficit is not a scoreboard, it's a system of choices, and choices always have consequences. Thanks so much for watching. Stay curious, keep your arguments nuanced, and I'll see you in the next one.